We share a history, Ace Attorney and I. A history that goes far back. How far? Well, it goes far enough that when I started the series, I used cartrecords.net as a resource to know more about it. That's how far back it goes. Damn, I'm old. But unlike other game franchises that I've lost interest over time as I got older, I always loved and probably always will love Ace Attorney, because ultimately, while it got new features and gimmicks as the series went along, it never dropped its core gameplay and premise at any point. Sure, it had some major shakeups as it shuffled its cast and tried to find new things to keep audiences engaged with even after decades of releases, but it never changed anything fundamental about the game's design. You can still pick up and play from the very first game to this day if you want to, and if you enjoy it, you're almost guaranteed to enjoy everything that comes after it to this very day. That's how similar the series is, all the way back to its original foundations. And call me an old codger, or is it codger? Anyway, I like when games don't try to meddle unnecessarily in what is already a clearly good formula. You don't need to change just for the sake of change. Being unbending on your ideas in the face of an industry that seems to constantly demand change for the sake of it can be a quality all of its own. But enough philosophizing. Just what is the gameplay of Ace Attorney? Well, if you're new to the series, here's a quick summary. You play as a defense attorney who gets involved in increasingly ridiculous cases filled with colorful characters. You usually get a cutie patootie assistant who helps you investigate in classic point-and-click fashion by clicking on every single goddamn pixel on the screen in search of evidence. And you can also present this evidence to different characters in order to progress through the story. Once you've progressed enough, the game will kick you out of investigation mode and into trial mode, which is where you must face off against a prosecutor that either exudes massive daddy energy or clearly moonlights as a dominatrix in order to prove your client's innocence. What usually happens is that the prosecution calls a witness to the stand, and then after their testimony, you can perform a cross-examination in which you can either present a piece of evidence to prove a contradiction in the testimony, or press the witness to elaborate on one of their statements in order to gather previously unmentioned evidence or to unlock new testimony that might contain a contradiction, thus allowing you to point it out and proceed to the next testimony until finally you can prove your client's innocence and you also find out the culprit, which is usually not an attorney's job, but okay. Oh yeah, and the autopsy report gets updated like 15 goddamn times during the course of a single trial as well. How the fuck does that happen? Did the victim die 15 fucking different times on the same day? Fucking hell. Well, anyway, the great Ace Attorney, in true Ace Attorney tradition, follows this formula to a T. Everything you know and love about Ace Attorney is still here, only with a few additional gimmicks, courtesy of a new witness system, and perhaps more importantly, the plot and time period the game is set. For you see, this time around you're not in modern Japan / California / Springfield whatever anymore. This time you start your journey in Meiji era Japan, that's the Victorian era by the way for those of you who don't know your Japanese eras, as a young student called Ryonosuke Naruhodo. And I completely butchered that name. But anyway, in true Ace Attorney fashion, he's arrested for murder before the game has even begun, and in true Ace Attorney fashion, he defends himself in court to prove his innocence, and of course a few hours later, he is now a defense lawyer in Victorian England, solving crimes with his new buddy, Sherlock Holmes. Yes, Sherlock Holmes. Just roll with it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's first explain the three main new features introduced in this game before we continue. The first one is having multiple witnesses on the stand at the same time, as well as allowing you to switch focus between witnesses during testimony after you press them. This allows you to pursue a witness that is not currently testifying but might offer relevant information. This also allows you to see the depths of the effort the writers must have put into this game, since even if you pursue an irrelevant character, they will still have unique dialogue, because Shu Takumi is a madman. Also, this isn't really new per se, since if you play every single game in the series obsessively like I do, then you might remember a very similar mechanic introduced in Professor Layton vs Phoenix Wright. But this is the first time it shows up in a mainline Ace Attorney series, for a certain measure of mainline I guess. But listen, my point is, if you played Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright? Then you're a certified cool person. Moving on to the next new mechanic, we got the summation examination, which happens only during the chapters that take place in England, and that's because England's courts have a jury composed of 6 jurors. And while in Japan the word of the judge is the absolute law, in England, if the 6 jurors at any point all agree that the defendant is guilty, then the trial will end with a guilty verdict, and vice versa. During trials, you will encounter the all guilty jury quite a few times, and during those times, Ryunosuke will request a summation examination, at which point each juror will present their reasoning for choosing the guilty verdict, and it's up to you to point out the contradiction in their reasoning. But this time, you're not trying to prove them wrong with evidence. Instead, you must pit 2 opinions against each other and let the jury fight amongst themselves. You can also press them for additional reasons, and you can pursue here as well, so it's basically a more elaborate, cooler version of cross-examination without the option to present evidence. And for the last big mechanic introduced, we got the absolutely fantastic great deductions. During those, Sherlock Holmes will deduce facts based on evidence he noticed, usually while in a crime scene or near a criminal or basically anywhere suspicious. And while his eyes are fantastic for detail, they will usually pick up on the wrong detail. So, when the deduction is done, Ryunosuke must perform a course correction in which the entire deduction is repeated up to a point where it is obviously wrong, and then the player must look around the scene or present the correct piece of evidence in order to push Sherlock towards the correct conclusions. While it can feel a bit like a pixel hunt in 3D at times, the presentation during these moments is absolutely spectacular, with characters flying around the screen, expert transitions as they move from place to place, all while spotlights appear to highlight the current focus of the deduction. It is bombastic, theatrical, and positively charming, and they are by far my most favorite addition to the series. And since we are talking about charming, we have to talk about the true hearts of the Ace Attorney franchise, the writing and the animations. The animations in particular are fantastic this time around. They are all done in 3D, and while they don't do anything crazy like in recent Guilty Gear games where they look like 2D animation in 3D, they are still incredible conveyors of each character's personality. Shout out in particular to Ryunosuke's animation where he tries to do the fabled desk slam only to completely fail and do a slap so wimpy he even double checks his own hands when he lands the hit. It's pretty damn funny. The writing this time around is also really good, but it varies from character to character, since a lot of them have tics and different ways to express themselves that might come across as charming or annoying, and they vary so much that I doubt anybody's coming out of this experience loving everybody. Some are just inevitably not going to gel with your tastes. As for the plot itself, it is quite different from the usual Ace Attorney realm, as it takes place literally centuries earlier than previous entries, but it also focuses more on an overarching plot and themes. Ryunosuke is a foreigner in ancient times, and that means racism and xenophobia come up a lot from a lot of characters. He also has to deal with the fact that he's paired up with one of the most scatterbrained versions of Sherlock Holmes, just roll with it, to date. One who is an adoptive father to Iris Wilson, a genius little girl with a bachelor's degree in medicine because anime that constantly comes up with crazy new inventions that could revolutionize the state of forensic science, except the court is simply too old school to accept these cutting-edge techniques as relevant evidence. And also they're racist too, they're just straight up racist, so he definitely has his work cut out for him. This makes the odds feel as stacked against the protagonist as they've ever been, and given the grey areas the game delves into, this might be one of the darkest Ace Attorney games to ever be released. In order to further discuss the game's story though, we must talk about structure. And in order to talk about structure, we're going to have to go into some very light spoiler territory. So, fair warning. If you want to go completely blind into it, then I definitely recommend the game. You can close this review right now and you can go purchase it and enjoy it. But if you don't mind knowing the very light spoiler of how many chapters the game has and how they are divided, then stick around, because we are going to have to go into one very weird anecdote. And that anecdote is that The Great Ace Attorney isn't one game like I've been referring to it so far. It is in fact 2 games. For the Western release of The Great Ace Attorney, Capcom decided to pack both games into a single package. A very clever decision since, unlike the previous games, The Great Ace Attorney 1 introduces a shitload of plot points that are only explained in The Great Ace Attorney 2, and 2 doesn't introduce any new mechanics that weren't already introduced in 1, so ultimately, this has the effect of making the entire thing feel like one big game at first glance, but unfortunately, it is not. It still is 2 games, and even with the same mechanics in play, I have to admit that the second game is vastly superior to the first game based on writing and structure alone. In order to understand why that is, we must delve deeper into the structure of classic Ace Attorney games. At the very start of each game, they usually ease you into its mechanics by starting a case already on trial. That way, they could put their best foot forward and showcase all of the mechanics unique to the series right out of the gate. The second case and so on would instead begin in investigation mode leading up to the trials, which were divided into multiple days, with investigation time in between the trial segments. Great Ace Attorney begins with a trial-only case as well, but it follows it up with an investigation-only case, only to follow it up with another trial-only case. This means that you only get 2 proper cases out of a total of 5 cases. And let me remind you that some of the mechanics like the great deductions can only happen during investigations, and the summation examination can only happen when there's a jury present and the first chapter takes place in Japan, so that also gets shafted. There's also another change that is much less noticeable but makes all of the difference in practice, and that is that the cases that have an investigation part only have one investigation section and one trial section. That means that each section feels overly long and stretched out, and also means that when you enter the trial, you will already have all of the evidence that you could have possibly gathered investigating. This means that you have a higher chance of figuring out the trial's plot twists way before the piece of evidence is relevant in court. If the cases were divided in the traditional way, there would have been plenty of chances to include new witnesses between trials and last-second twists that could have made for less predictable and thus more thrilling trial. It's not like the developers did this for funsies though. This is all done in service of another very weird departure from the established series, and that is that The Great Ace Attorney has a giant, epic, overarching plot connecting all of its cases. In the original Ace Attorney, it wasn't uncommon for characters to have their backstories explained in cases, usually those that raised the stakes, but most cases were standalone stories by themselves. This time around, however, Yunosuke doesn't have a backstory. Instead, he has a whole goddamn character arc, as he finds out about what kind of path he wants to follow as a lawyer. And every single case, from the very first to the very last, are related to each other in ways both minor and major, so this ends up feeling like one big story instead of a mystery of the week kind of deal. It ends up dealing with themes that the series has struggled with for years, like how much can you truly believe in your client, what is true justice, and if you should always pursue the truth, even at the cost of your own client. And all of this is set with the backdrop of a judicial system that's portrayed as inherently flawed and that constantly allows bad people to evade justice with the use of guile and corruption. This definitely feels a whole lot more like the dark age of the law than Ace Attorney 5 did, that's for sure. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter if your overarching story is good if everything between the actual interesting plot beats feel like boring filler. And that's not exactly true of the first game either. I personally think all of the cases are good, but none of them rise above their level to become truly spectacular. Every single one of them has parts that drag them down from great to just good, or they are great but end up in an unsatisfying manner. Hell, one case ends up in a baffling manner, only to be immediately followed by a case that feels like pure filler, and all of that only gets addressed later, sometimes only in the second game. For a series known for its insane villain breakdown animations and satisfying endings to each trial, the first game suffers from a serious case of lack of breakdowns and lack of satisfying villains overall, only to have the few satisfying ones to have truly unsatisfying conclusions to their arcs. It is overall a game that feels like it should have been 10 hours long, stretched into 30 hours. Now, I know this paints the first game on a very unflattering light, so let me repeat myself, it is not a bad game. There's lots to love about it, like the fantastic great deductions, which are great no matter which game they're on, but unfortunately, there's just not as much to love about it as the previous games, which makes it all the more baffling that the Great Ace Attorney 2 came out as a contender to one of the best goddamn games in the entire series. Trying out new things is always a gamble, and it doesn't always pay off. It's clear that the developers thought some of it didn't pay off with the first game, because here in the second, we are back to the traditional formula of having a trial-only introductory case, followed by cases that all have multiple sections of both investigation and trial, thus allowing more room for late plot twists and witnesses, and making sure to mix things up so neither of the segments feel too overwhelmingly long. Almost all of the villains this time around have satisfying breakdown animations, and I'll let the ones that don't slide because of just how amazing the breakdowns are on the second game, and each individual case feels like a thrilling mystery to solve as standalone adventures by themselves, while also contributing to the overarching plot that comes to a head during the final trials of the game, which I assume is the feel they were trying to convey during the first game. Special congratulations are in order for the third case in particular, which is an honest contender for best case in the entire series. It is filled with amazing twists, contains by far the craziest great deduction animations in the entire duology, and features some of the coolest character designs in the entire series. Of course, a lot of the characters and all of the previously unsolved plot points and themes that were introduced in the previous game are further elaborated upon here, so don't even think about skipping to this entry. You must play the first game first. Great Ace Attorney 1 walked so 2 could run and all that stuff. Oh, and before we move on, I should also say that they really ramped up the difficulty in this one, so it felt like I was actually solving cases once again. I didn't mention it, but the first one felt really easy and streamlined at times. Like, I kept waiting for the game to get to the damn point so I could just present the relevant evidence, and while that is a feeling that happens in all sorts of different Ace Attorney games, in this one was particularly egregious because of how obvious the solution was. But in the second one, I got genuinely blindsided a lot and had to do some critical thinking to figure out how to counter the testimonies. And this change even extends to the investigations. In the first game, whenever you had to present evidence during an investigation, characters would literally spell out what you needed to present to who, while in 2, I actually had to think about when it was appropriate to present which evidence with no hints. And while some people might hate getting stuck in those situations, I particularly enjoy having to do a bit of thinking so it doesn't feel like the game is just on autopilot outside of trials. And for the people who do want the game to work in autopilot, this entry includes an option that allows you to simply read through the story like a pure visual novel, while the game does the detective work for you. So no use complaining about that. Ha! The soundtrack is, as always, pretty good. Though both of the games use a lot of the same tracks, so some of them can feel a little bit repetitive come the end of the duology, but I digress. I honestly shouldn't complain about the soundtrack that has this level of banger on it. There's definitely something weird about the controls in this game on PC though. I think. Maybe, definitely, but probably. The game instructs you only based on your keyboard controls, but the game is playable entirely with a mouse, except you have to click on the buttons on the lower right of the screen, and they definitely don't look clickable. They look more like instructions, and I couldn't help but feel like they could have put a little extra effort into making them look like clickable buttons. And they also weirdly change position and add new buttons if there are new possible interactions. So if you advance the dialogue by clicking on the lower part of the screen like I do, you can accidentally end up pressing an option. And there's also the reticule during investigations and even during trials when you need to point some things out, except that the way they work is you click on them and then they move to a position, and then you click on them again when the reticule is on top of the item you want to examine in order to examine the actual item. And if you just want to adjust the position a little bit, then the game just refuses to do so and assumes that you wanted to click on the same place again, and it just examines the same thing again. And I'm not saying it's a big issue or anything, it's just that if you plan to play this game using the mouse only like I did, then you should expect some weirdness. This game was clearly planned for a dual screen layout. However, if there's a true Achilles heel that extends to both entries, it is definitely the main prosecutor this time around, Baron van Zieks. Make no mistake, I love the man, and he also undergoes a fantastic character arc, and I definitely understand why he is the way he is, but the problem is, he's just too cool. So yeah, I'm accusing this duology of failing to grasp the dangers of being too cool. Edgeworth was also cool, but when you cornered him, the man started sweating bullets. It was clear when he was out of his depth, because he ultimately, like every other Ace Attorney character, was only human beneath his eccentricities. Meanwhile, Van Zieks only gets a weirdly short damage animation and is otherwise constantly composed. Even at the end of everything, the man can't even change expressions. And this is a characteristic that unfortunately he shares with a few other characters who are just too cold for you to break through their facades, and in the end that just makes them opponents that aren't as fun to tackle as the one from previous entries. Aside from that last take that I think some people might think is a bit just too spicy for them though, the second game is absolutely perfect, and that's why with a good first entry and an excellent second one, I can definitely recommend The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles to fans of the series. The problem with recommending it to just about anyone, even though I think the game is really good, is that I don't want to be that guy that says, oh, but he gets good 30 hours in, because yes, each game is like 30 hours, and the second game is so much better than the first one that it's possible that you're going to buy this and then you're not going to enjoy the first one, assuming of course you never played an Ace Attorney game and you're not going to enjoy the first one, but you keep going through it in order to reach the second one because you think maybe I'll like the second one. But the truth is, if you don't at least enjoy a little bit the first one, you probably won't the second one either. This isn't a case of it gets good 30 hours in. If you can't get into this headspace of enjoying this crazy detective adventure, it's just never going to get fantastic, you know? But if you do enjoy the first game, then the second one is just absolutely spectacular. And if you're a fan of mystery, of visual novels, of text, of story, and if you can handle all of the craziness, then I can definitely recommend The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. It is definitely a good game, and Capcom hit it out of the park once again. So, on the accounts of being a bad game and a waste of time, I declare The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles Get it? It's not guilty of being bad. It means it's good. You get it's a joke. I'll shut up now.